Welcome to Historic Lullabies. I'm so glad you're here. Whether this is your first time drifting into one of our stories, or you've returned like an old friend, thank you for joining this quiet moment. Tonight's journey might feel a little silly, a little surreal, and perhaps a bit saucy. Now, take a slow breath. You are here to unravel a story about a tomato. Yes, the plump, red, shiny thing you slice into your sandwich without a second thought. Tonight, it becomes something else. A feared object. A misunderstood marvel. A fruit that once lived in the shadows of suspicion. Let's begin softly. There was a time in American history when people truly believed tomatoes were deadly. Not metaphorically. Not metaphorically like, ugh, I hate tomatoes. They're poison. No, they believed that if you so much as bit into one, it could end your life. And yet, they grew them anyway. They decorated their gardens with them. They stared at them. They whispered about them. So tonight, we're going to follow that strange little tomato from its wild roots in the Andes to the dining tables of old Europe, and finally into the wary hearts of early Americans. This is a story of fear, of misunderstanding, and of one heroic bite that changed everything. I hope this story helps you relax, maybe even drift off to sleep. But fair warning, it's just odd enough that you might stay awake, giggling at how deeply humans can fear a salad ingredient. If you do, at least you'll wake up knowing a fruit once accused of murder now lives in your fridge without incident. Before we float too far into tonight's story, a gentle like or subscribe would mean a lot and helps Historic Lullabies keep growing quietly. And if you'd like, feel free to share in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Knowing we're all scattered across sleepy corners of the world makes this feel a little more magical. Now, let your eyes grow soft. Let your shoulders lower. Breathe in, slowly, and out, even slower. Let's begin. You find yourself walking through a dusky garden in a place that doesn't quite exist. Part Italy, part Virginia, part memory. The sun is low, the air is warm and sweet, and vines twist gently along the edge of a faded stone wall. At the center of the garden, a small red fruit gleams like a jewel in the last golden light of the day. It looks innocent enough, but in this moment, centuries ago, someone sees it and steps back in alarm. Because that's no harmless fruit. That's a love apple. That's a nightshade. That's trouble. The story of the tomato begins far from American soil, in the mountains of South America, long before it became a topping for pizza or the heart of ketchup. The tomato grew wild in what is now Peru and Ecuador, tiny, tart, and not very red at all. The indigenous peoples of the Andes had cultivated and eaten it for generations. But it didn't remain there. Through trade and colonization, it eventually made its way north and then east, crossing the Atlantic into Europe. That's where things started to get complicated. Europe in the 1500s was not especially fond of new things. And unfortunately for the tomato, it arrived with baggage. It belonged to a plant family with a truly unfortunate name, nightshade, the same family as deadly belladonna, the same family as mandrake root, long associated with witches and hallucinations and strange dreams. The leaves of the tomato plant were bitter and smelled odd. It looked too vivid to be trustworthy. And worst of all, it was beautiful, just the kind of thing suspicious minds thought a poison should look like. So, people grew tomatoes, but only as decorations, like a sinister bouquet. They admired them from afar. They let them ripen, then rot, but eat them? Never. Who would be foolish enough to put something that red and gleaming into their mouth? You might chuckle now, in the dim quiet of your room. imagining someone screaming at a tomato. But back then, the fear was real. And, oddly enough, part of it wasn't entirely wrong. Because in the old world, particularly in Europe's aristocratic kitchens, people often dined on pewter plates. And pewter, when in contact with acidic foods, like tomatoes, could leach lead. So if someone dared to slice into a tomato and place it on a fine pewter dish, they might fall ill, very ill. And no one blamed the plate. They blamed the tomato. It was a cursed fruit, a devil's trap. Or, perhaps, something meant only for gazing. Even the name made people wary. Pomodoro in Italian, golden apple, pomme d'amour in French, love apple. Too romantic, too mysterious, too soft. And yet, in the warm silence of certain hidden kitchens, far from suspicion, someone, somewhere, probably dared to taste it. Just a sliver, just enough to question what everyone else feared. But for most of the 16th and 17th centuries, tomatoes remained outsiders in the European diet. They grew in noble gardens and monastery plots. They bloomed and withered without ceremony. And when settlers crossed the sea to begin life in the American colonies, they brought tomato seeds with them, but also all their fears. So, in early America, the tomato took root, not in the pot, but in the parlor. Not in the stew, but in the garden border. Admired like a strange cousin, you're too polite to shoo away, but far too nervous to invite to dinner. In this quiet corner of history, the tomato sits, round, glossy, suspicious. It waits. The warmth of that twilight garden lingers as you follow the faint rustle of leaves along the vine. The tomato is no longer a solitary stranger. It's the beginning of something that will slowly, quietly travel across oceans, over mountains, and through suspicion. Like so many plants that shape human stories, the tomato's journey starts not with fear, but with familiarity, just not in the places you might expect. You pause near a field of volcanic soil, high in the Andes Mountains. The air is crisp here, and the tomatoes are nothing like the ones in your grocery store. They are small, yellow-orange, and a little tart. They don't spill over baskets in abundance, and they certainly aren't sitting beside fresh mozzarella. But these humble fruits have been cultivated and cherished by the indigenous peoples of the region for longer than records can trace. To them, tomatoes aren't forbidden. They're food, part of the earth, a gift. The Aztecs, too, come into view, their bustling markets in Tenochtitlan filled with offerings, cacao beans, maize, chilies, and tomatoes. They called it zitamatl, meaning plump thing with a navel. In that word, you can almost hear the quiet affection, the comfort of something known. Their cuisine embraced it, grinding it into sauces, stirring it into stews. For the peoples of Mesoamerica, the tomato had no mystery, only flavor. And then the ships came, Spanish conquistadors, armored in ambition and steel, arrived seeking gold, land, power, and unknowingly, they gathered seeds. The tomato was one of countless plants they carried back across the Atlantic, tucked in with tobacco, chocolate, and potatoes. They may not have understood what they were bringing home, but still, it came. The fruit reached Spain in the early 1500s, blooming in the Iberian sun with remarkable ease. From there, it spread outward, into Italy, France, and the cautious corners of northern Europe. But while it grew effortlessly in southern soil, the tomato met a much colder reception at the dining table. You imagine now a noble Italian garden, elegant stonework, gentle fountains, and vines heavy with jewel-like tomatoes. The gardeners admire them. The guests admire them. They are exotic, decorative, and new. But when the cook suggests adding them to supper, there's hesitation. Whispers. "Isn't that a nightshade?" someone asks. The tomato's reputation darkens before it has a chance to shine. This is not the arrival it deserves. And yet, it isn't a rejection either. The tomato isn't cast out. It's simply observed, treated like an ornamental novelty, something too beautiful or too suspicious to bite. In the soft rhythm of Mediterranean life, the tomato becomes a paradox, prized in gardens, feared in kitchens. You can almost hear the rustling of silk skirts passing through villa corridors as noble women gossip about its color, its shine, its uncanny resemblance to poisonous plants. Lovely, they murmur, but not for eating. Still, some try. Brave farmers, humble cooks, and herbalists whispering to one another under moonlight. They slice a piece here and there, taste it carefully. And when they don't fall ill, their confidence grows, especially in Italy, where the tomato begins to sneak into the cuisine like a well-kept secret. But acceptance is slow. It's not just science that decides what people eat. It's culture, it's rumor, it's fear, and tomatoes, tangled up in a family of dangerous plants, arriving on ships from foreign shores, blooming in gardens like forbidden fruit, are easy to distrust. Meanwhile, the tomato's cousin, the potato, finds its own winding road into favor. Potatoes at least can be hidden underground. But tomatoes, they sit right there on the branch, flashing their red warning like a siren. And so, across Europe, for more than a century, the tomato plays a quiet game of double identity. It is a fruit caught in limbo, too exotic to ignore, too strange to trust. When the tomato finally crosses the sea again, this time to the American colonies, it does not arrive as food, but as curiosity. It is passed from gardener to gardener, sprouting in tidy rows beside marigolds and beans. People in places like Virginia and Pennsylvania raise the plants not to eat them, but to admire their colors. They are called love apples now, which somehow makes them even less likely to end up in a stew. You don't eat a love apple, you sigh at it. Still, there's something tender in this moment, something funny and familiar. Humans love to name things they don't understand. They give them poetic labels, floral metaphors, warnings wrapped in whimsy. And while the tomato waits patiently in colonial gardens, its name does much of the heavy lifting in keeping forks away. The colonies, after all, were cautious. Food was survival. There was little room for experimentation, especially with things that grew too well, too brightly, or too differently. There were pamphlets on herbal medicine, sermons about gluttony, and garden journals that offered no clear guidance on whether the tomato was a delight or a danger. And so, the fruit settled into the scenery, present but not present, real but avoided. A guest at the party who never gets a dance. What a strange fate for something so familiar to us now. You might be curled up under your blanket now, perhaps with your phone glowing softly on the nightstand, or your headphones gently humming in your ears. Somewhere in your house, there's a tomato, in your fridge, in a jar, on a shelf, harmless, welcome, expected, but once it was a question, it was a whisper. And tomorrow, if you remember any of this, maybe you'll glance at your salad a little differently, remembering that this bright little fruit had to earn your trust, slowly, over centuries, not through science, but through silence and time, and all it ever did was sit there, waiting. Still nestled in the quiet glow of curiosity, you now find yourself wandering deeper into a garden of names, not the kind whispered between friends, but the kind printed in old herbal texts and murmured by cautious physicians. You follow the path slowly, letting the warm air settle against your skin. Ahead of you, the vines twist again, But this time, they're entangled not just with tomatoes, but with shadows of their family, the nightshades. It sounds like a word from a ghost story. Nightshade, a name that drips with mystery, as if dusk itself had grown roots and bloomed under the moon. But in truth, it's a botanical label, one that binds together a group of plants with vastly different personalities. Some are gentle and nourishing, others are famously deadly, and somewhere in the middle is the tomato, the Solanaceae family. That's the scientific name, though no one called it that in colonial kitchens. In those days, people trusted folklore more than Latin. If one plant in the family was dangerous, better assume the others were, too. It was guilt by association, a leafy kind of slander. You pause beside a thicket of henbane, its flowers drooping with sleepy menace. Belladonna grows nearby, also called deadly nightshade, its berries glossy and dark, like forbidden pearls. These were not food, these were poisons, rituals, and whispered legends. In Renaissance apothecaries, belladonna was used with fear and reverence, sometimes to dilate pupils, sometimes to summon visions, and sometimes, regrettably, to end lives. Now, imagine planting a tomato nearby. To the average observer, it was close enough to be dangerous. Its leaves had a bitter smell, its vines tangled like wild thoughts, and if a single bite could possibly carry you into the afterlife, why risk it? Even the term love apple did the tomato no favors. It sounded romantic, yes, but also suspicious. Aphrodisiacs were considered dangerous in certain circles, as if desire itself could unhinge the body. The tomato, red and ripe and gleaming, looked too perfect, and in a world shaped by religious warnings and medical guesswork, perfection was cause for concern. So, the tomato waited again. And it wasn't the only misunderstood member of the family. The potato, too, had to earn its place. Even eggplants were eyed with suspicion in some regions. But the tomato suffered especially because of how visible it was. It didn't hide underground. It didn't hang discreetly. It announced itself, bright and unmissable, a fruit dressed like a warning. By now, you're probably curled deeper into your pillow, feeling the weight of history slow your breath. Let it. These ancient names are like lullabies themselves, sung in strange syllables, tied to old fears and deeper hungers. Nightshade, henbane, mandrake, thorn apple. They whisper of mystery and medicine, of danger and drama. And they whisper around the tomato, too, reminding everyone who dares to look too closely. This one belongs to us. You picture an old English gardener, tugging his cap low as he walks among the plants. He pinches a tomato stem, frowns, and mutters something under his breath about witches. Not because he's ignorant, but because he knows just enough to be wary. And caution, in those days, was often considered wisdom. The irony, of course, is that today many of our most beloved vegetables, tomatoes, potatoes, eggplants, and peppers, come from this very family. A family that once carried suspicion now fills stews, salsas, and summer salads. A transformation so complete it feels like forgetting. And yet, if you brush your hand across a tomato vine, if you lean in and catch that sharp, green scent, there's something ancestral about it, something that tells you this fruit knows its past. It remembers what it was called. It remembers being feared. Back then, people didn't have the tools to prove safety. There were no labs, no labels, just stories, experiments, and caution. And plants weren't judged only by how they tasted. They were judged by shape, color, smell, and by resemblance to the plants that had hurt people before. If it looked like a poison, it probably was. And so, many chose to leave tomatoes untouched. They let them ripen and fall. They admired them like dangerous art. The fruit became a metaphor for temptation, not unlike the fabled apple in a different garden. Theologically, too, the idea of a seductive but dangerous fruit held weight. People had grown up hearing that the very first act of disobedience began with a bite. How easy it must have been to look at the tomato and think, "Not again?" It's funny how history folds over on itself, how a fruit can carry echoes of sin and science, pleasure and punishment, and all it ever does is sit on the vine. But not everyone feared it. In small pockets of Europe, in southern Italy especially, tomatoes began to sneak their way into sauces, stews, and savory pies. The further south you went, the more the sun seemed to melt suspicion. There, you could find families cooking with tomatoes in quiet defiance of public fear, a handful of recipes passed down quietly, generation to generation, slipping past the wary glances of guests. And those who tasted the dishes, who braved the first bites, found not death, but delight. Still, in many regions, the fear persisted, and as settlers made their way to America, they brought not only seeds, but also superstition. The tomato would have to win them over all over again. You might think of this as the longest charm offensive in fruit history, a campaign that lasted centuries, with no spokesperson and no speeches, just time, just patience, just the quiet work of being what it is. Now, as your breathing slows and your eyelids soften, the weight of all those old names seems to drift away. The garden becomes softer. The nightshade vines begin to blur into the shadows. And somewhere nearby, a tomato blushes under the moonlight, still waiting, still hoping to be trusted. The moon above the garden glows just a little fuller now, casting silvery reflections across the leaves. You hear the gentle rustle of vines shifting in the evening air, like they're remembering something old, something whispered, something magical, or perhaps something feared. You walk carefully along the garden's edge, and in your mind, the setting changes. The tomato vine fades, the air turns cooler, spiced with wood smoke and superstition. You're not in a garden anymore. You're somewhere darker, somewhere wrapped in cloaks, whispers, and candlelight. This is the world of witchcraft and folklore, and the tomato, so red, so round, so strangely proud among its green stems, fits all too neatly into the stories that once haunted kitchens and church pews alike. Long ago, people didn't separate food from belief the way we do today. Every bite came with a story. Every herb had a moral. Garlic warded off evil. Basil meant love. Rosemary was for remembrance. And certain plants were not only suspect, they were considered invitations to the unknown, or worse, to sin. In that world, the tomato was not simply new. It was unclean, an outsider, a fruit that grew like it didn't care what the others thought. Its flesh was soft. Its juice was red, too red, like blood. It ripened rapidly, almost impatiently, and when it fell, it did so messily, splitting open like something shameful. It didn't help that the tomato shared a garden with the notorious mandrake, another nightshade, but one with roots that curled like limbs and legends that screamed when you pulled them up. People once believed the mandrake's cry could kill. They tied dogs to the stems and covered their ears before harvest. Real or not, the story held weight. And the tomato, distant cousin though it was, absorbed the suspicion. You imagine now a medieval herbalist, her hands stained from roots and berries, her breath sharp with mint and mead. She knows the stories. She's heard of women accused of casting spells with plants like belladonna, henbane, and mandrake. She's careful which leaves she picks, and when. Even healing herbs, in the wrong hands or at the wrong time, could mean accusations, could mean fire. So, when the tomato appears in gardens, bright, red, pulsing with possibility, it's easy to see how the fear took root. Some said the fruit caused hallucinations. Others believed it incited lust. There were rumors it could inflame the blood or cloud the mind. A few went further, suggesting it was the devil's fruit, a temptress on a stem. You pause to consider how quiet fear can grow, not with screaming, but with silence, with sidelong glances and half-finished sentences, the kind of fear that spreads not through proof, but through tone. A muttered, "Don't eat that," at a market stall. A mother gently pulling her child away from a vine without explanation. A priest frowning at a plate just long enough to raise doubt. The tomato didn't need to kill anyone to gain a reputation. It just needed time and shadows. In folklore, red was always a dangerous color. Think of the apple in the fairy tale, bright, shiny, poisoned. Think of the crimson cloak, the stain on snow, the drop of blood that ruins the white cloth. The tomato, blazing red under the sun, looked like it ought to be cursed, too vivid for innocence. And yet, in the shadows of suspicion, some found fascination. Certain apothecaries, particularly those in southern Europe, believed the tomato might have medicinal potential, though they were careful to phrase it as experimental. They dried the skins, boiled the pulp, tried it in tiny doses for gout, melancholy, sluggish digestion, and when patients didn't drop dead, a new idea quietly took root. Perhaps the fruit was useful, after all, but even utility didn't erase its image. Because in a world where stories carried more weight than science, the tomato had become more than a fruit. It had become a symbol of temptation, of danger, of the uncertain line between nature and magic. There were stories, especially in rural towns, of women who grew tomatoes in secret, who boiled them into brews not for healing, but for attraction. Love apples, they were still called, with a smirk, or a wink, or a warning. It was said you could slip a slice into a stew and win someone's heart, or their body, or their soul. Historians still argue whether any of that was believed in earnest, or if it was the fearful invention of suspicious neighbors. But whether true or not, the fear stuck. A tomato wasn't just a tomato. It was a whisper, a risk, a red flag. And so, when the tomato arrived in America, it came wrapped not just in vines and soil, but in centuries of lore. Settlers may not have remembered the Latin names or the rituals of European apothecaries, but they carried the unease, the caution, the superstition. That's the quiet power of folklore. It travels invisibly. It doesn't need passports or books. It rides in glances and gestures, in the pause before a bite. Even in early American almanacs, tidy, handwritten collections of seasonal advice, the tomato was listed ambiguously, sometimes mentioned as a curiosity, other times not at all. Its presence was tolerated, but its purpose, unclear. And so, like many things tangled in myth, the tomato lingered at the edge of acceptability, neither forbidden nor embraced. A plant too proud to vanish, and too misunderstood to belong. You breathe slowly, deeply now. The idea of a tomato as a magical object may seem silly under electric lights and microwave ovens, but in the hush of a candlelit kitchen, centuries ago, with owls calling in the distance and the wind rattling the shutters, it might not have seemed so silly at all. It might have seemed like something to fear, or maybe something to respect. And so, the tomato slept under the stars, growing, ripening, waiting again, waiting for someone not to fear it, just to taste. You remain in that quiet space between wonder and sleep, where facts feel like dreams and memories borrow from myth. The red fruit waits with you, unassuming, patient, ripening in the corner of your imagination. But now, it whispers a particular tale, not one of witches or rumors, but of a prince, a plate, a single fatal bite. You follow the whisper gently into the 1700s. The air smells different here, heavier, tinged with ink and brass. This is the age of powdered wigs and polished pewter, of lavish feasts served beneath chandeliers, where fine society dines not only to eat, but to be seen, a world where appearance trumps practicality, and sometimes safety. At one of these long, gleaming banquet tables, the story begins. A wealthy European nobleman, some say a prince, others a lesser lord, sits surrounded by delicacies. He is dressed in velvet and gold thread. The wine is rich, the servants silent, the silverware ornate. A dish is brought forth, glistening with novelty. On it, sliced tomatoes, their juices pooling in little crimson moons across the polished pewter plate. He eats them, and within hours, he is dead. That's how the story goes. One bite, one brilliant mistake, and suddenly, the tomato is feared anew, not because of its family name or rumored magical properties, but because it killed a man, in public, on a plate. What no one understood at the time was this. It wasn't the tomato that killed him. It was the plate. You see, pewter, the favored material for elegant tableware in the 18th century, was made with lead. It was lovely, yes, but also treacherous. Acidic foods like tomatoes react with lead, leaching it into the food. It's a silent exchange, a flavorless betrayal. So, when that poor nobleman ate his stylish salad, the acid from the tomato drew the poison from the pewter. He didn't taste it. No one ever does. But the lead entered his body all the same, soft-footed and irreversible. Historians still argue whether this event happened as cleanly and dramatically as the legend suggests. Some doubt the timeline. Others question the identity of the victim. But regardless of its accuracy, the tale spread. It stuck. It served a purpose. Tomatoes kill. That's what people remembered. And once that idea takes hold, even if it starts from a misunderstanding, it can linger for generations. You can picture the gossip, soft-spoken servants repeating the tale to merchants, who share it with travelers, who whisper it to wives and children in marketplaces, along docks, across oceans. In America, the story found a particularly receptive audience. The colonies were a place of cautious optimism, where every food was both opportunity and potential threat. Farming was hard, spoilage was real, and new crops weren't just a curiosity, they were a risk. What you chose to grow might determine whether your family thrived or went hungry. So, the idea that the tomato had killed someone, anyone, was more than a myth. It was a warning. You imagine a farmer hearing the tale while sipping cider at dusk. He nods solemnly, then decides to move his tomato vines a little further from the house. Not because he's sure they're dangerous, but because, what if they are? Better safe than sorry. In truth, no tomato ever killed anyone just by being a tomato. But the poison of misunderstanding, that spreads easily, and once it wraps itself around a story, it becomes part of the fruit's legacy. So, the tomato, through no fault of its own, came to symbolize a sort of edible treachery, a red flag in the garden, a decorative dare, and yet, even as fear lingered, so did curiosity. Some people wondered, if the story was true, why didn't everyone who ate a tomato die? Why were some families daring to try them and living to tell the tale? A few brave souls began experimenting in private. They tried just a slice. They waited. Nothing happened. Then another bite. Still fine. And slowly, very slowly, confidence began to build. But that tale of the prince and the poisoned plate, It never quite disappeared. It remained tucked in the corners of seed catalogs, buried in almanac footnotes, hinted at in quiet family lore. A bedtime story for gardeners, a soft-spoken threat. And it wasn't the only story of accidental poison. In the 1700s and 1800s, many foods, now considered perfectly safe, were feared for similar reasons. Mushrooms, for instance, rhubarb leaves, even potatoes had their doubters. Nature, after all, doesn't label her ingredients, and the line between nourishment and danger can be thin. Thinner still when fear writes the recipe. So, the tomato was grouped among those maybe foods, the ones that looked a little too pretty, that sat a little too confidently on the branch, the ones that came with just enough lore to make you pause. You might wonder, as you lie quietly now, whether we still carry such suspicions, if there are still fruits we refuse to try, dishes we avoid because a great-grandparent once called them strange, maybe not poison, but still unsettling. The mind holds on to caution in curious ways, and the body follows. But the tomato's story, even wrapped in confusion, was not yet done, because eventually someone, brave or hungry or just plain stubborn, would step into the light, lift a tomato high, and prove that this fruit, so long feared, was nothing more than delicious. That moment is coming, but for now, in the soft hum of your imagination, the nobleman's plate still sits gleaming, empty, innocent-looking, and yet unforgettable. The tomato watches from the vine, waiting for history to clear its name. The nobleman's story fades gently, like the echo of a tale told too many times around too many tables. You drift now toward a different garden, smaller, simpler, bordered not by marble or wrought iron, but by wooden fences and sandy soil. The air is lighter here, carrying the faint scent of baking bread and earth still wet from morning dew. This is the American colonies, a world both older and newer than it seems. Here, life moves at a slower pace. Every crop is planted with intention. Every meal is the result of effort, chance, and careful trust. And in these modest plots of land, tomatoes grow once again, not as food, but as decoration, as curiosity. You imagine a settler in Pennsylvania, bending over her kitchen garden. Her bonnet shields her eyes, but she glances sideways at a row of tomato vines, their fruit just beginning to turn red. She doesn't plan to eat them, of course not, but they're lovely, and the neighbors are growing them too. That has to mean something. In colonial America, the tomato is not feared with the same dramatic superstition that gripped old Europe. Here, it's more subtle, less about witchcraft, more about wariness. There's no grand rejection, just an ongoing absence from the plate. People grow tomatoes because they're fashionable, because they're new, because they make gardens look lively and exotic. But eating them, that's another matter. Most households aren't willing to gamble dinner on a plant that might, just might, be poisonous. And so, the tomato becomes a kind of social object. People talk about them the way they talk about weather or distant cousins. Oh, I saw Abigail's tomatoes today. Very plump. The Thompsons have 3 rows, imagine. Do you think anyone's actually eaten one? It's gossip, but gentle, and it's laced with something almost like admiration. After all, the tomato is undeniably beautiful. And in a world of gray wool, wooden floors, and plain porridge, that vivid red must have seemed like a color from another world. Even the names they gave it sound unsure. Love apple, garden pearl, paradise fruit. Words that both elevate and sidestep the thing itself. Not tomato, not food, something else. At church picnics and town fairs, tomatoes are sometimes entered in contests for size, for shape, for their cheerful gleam. Children point at them with sticky fingers. Old men nod approvingly at the vine's yield, but no one brings them in a pie. You can almost hear the hum of summer insects in the background, the crack of laundry snapping on the line, the creak of a rocking chair as a grandmother warns, without drama. We don't eat those. No explanation. Just a pause. A space where knowledge once might have been, or maybe never was. And yet, there are whispers. There are always whispers. Old Henry tried one. I heard, "Still walking, isn't he? Well, he's always been a bit peculiar." This is how a reputation changes, slowly and sideways, not with announcements or experiments, but with quiet acts of rebellion. Someone eats one, nothing happens, then someone else. And the gossip starts to shift. The tomato begins to move, not quickly but steadily, from forbidden to questionable to maybe worth trying. But not everyone is convinced, not yet. The colonial diet is cautious by nature. Foods are familiar, repetitive, and practical. There's no time for culinary exploration when every meal is hard-earned. Corn, beans, salted pork, apples, these are trusted staples. The tomato, bright and soft and foreign, feels indulgent, unnecessary, suspicious. In some places, tomatoes are even believed to cause illness unrelated to poison. Hot blood, some say, digestive unrest. A fruit too fiery, too juicy, too southern for proper Yankee digestion. There's no science behind it, only sensation. And in a world without refrigeration, people have learned to trust their gut, especially when it says, maybe not. Meanwhile, in kitchens and gardens all along the coast, the tomato continues its quiet performance. It grows easily. It resists pests. It thrives in poor soil. It gives and gives, asking nothing in return except to be eaten. But instead, it is admired, feared, compared to apples, nicknamed like a family pet, anything but chewed. And yet, there are letters, diaries, smudged recipes passed from hand to hand that hint, just hint at experimentation. A tomato sliced thin and sprinkled with sugar, a stew that accidentally included one. Notes like, no ill effects noticed, or quite tasty, though unexpected. These aren't public declarations. They're confessions, like someone saying they danced with the devil and found him polite. Historians still argue whether these early American colonists truly believed the tomato to be poisonous, or simply didn't know what to do with it. But the result is the same: suspicion without confirmation, a fruit present but not invited. It's a strange kind of limbo. The tomato as a guest in the garden, but a ghost in the kitchen. You might smile now, tucked under the covers, at the thought of a fruit that inspired so much discussion without ever saying a word. A fruit that shaped part of American culinary history simply by refusing to be eaten. But the story isn't done. Not yet. Because somewhere, perhaps in Virginia or New Jersey, someone is about to do something extraordinary. Something so simple, it will be remembered for centuries. Something that will make the tomato stand tall, no longer just decoration. Someone is going to take a bite. But for now, the gardens sleep. The tomatoes hang heavy on the vine, full of juice, full of color, full of potential. And the gossip continues, soft and uncertain. They're pretty, though, very pretty, and still untouched. The tomato still waits. You can almost feel it now, nestled gently among marigolds and beans, its skin warm from the sun, pulsing with color. It leans slightly on the vine, not from weariness, but from fullness, a quiet readiness. But in the homes, it watches from the windowsill, in the kitchens where it sits in delicate bowls. It will not be eaten tonight. It will be admired. In colonial America and well into the 1800s, the tomato enjoyed a rather glamorous, if confusing, role as an object of visual delight, a centerpiece, a talking point, a strange and vibrant guest who never quite made it to the table. And while it wasn't welcome in stew pots, it was more than welcome in parlors, drawing rooms, and decorative plates meant to impress. You picture a wooden farmhouse with polished floors and lace curtains. In the center of the dining room table sits a delicate bowl, perhaps painted with hand-drawn violets or a faded gold trim, and inside, a small pyramid of tomatoes, bright red, gleaming, arranged just so, not food, art. It's easy to forget how rare vivid color once was in daily life. Before synthetic dyes, before mass-produced packaging and neon signs, red was extraordinary, and a tomato, ripened to that soft, almost translucent red-orange. It was dazzling, like a sunset you could hold. Guests commented on them. A fine specimen, they might say, leaning forward politely. No one asked to taste one. That would be strange. But everyone nodded in appreciation, the way they might admire a painting or a pressed flower in a book. Tomatoes even found their way into fashion, not in fabric, of course, but in inspiration. The term love apple gave it a romantic air, and romanticism was a beloved currency. Young women were sometimes given tomato-shaped trinket boxes or embroidery patterns featuring the curving vines and the delicate blossoms. There are even records of tomato-shaped pincushions, soft fabric fruit stuffed with sawdust, symbolizing prosperity and placed near hearths. To own a tomato, or even a symbol of one, was to participate in something modern, something exotic, and still. It wasn't eaten. You might wonder, lying here in the hush of night, how something could be so cherished and so avoided at once. But humans have always done this, held objects at arm's length, loved them for their mystery more than their meaning. The tomato wasn't alone in this. Pineapples, too, were once used as decoration rather than dessert. In fact, pineapples were so rare and expensive in colonial America that people rented them, displayed at parties as symbols of luxury, and then returned uneaten. A fruit as a statement, a fruit as a guest star. Tomatoes were humbler, of course, but the idea was similar. Their presence said something about the homeowner. They were daring, worldly, a little playful, but not reckless. After all, they hadn't eaten one. Still, not everyone viewed them as mere decoration. Farmers, particularly in the warmer southern colonies, noticed how resilient tomatoes were. They grew in poor soil. They withstood pests. They required little coaxing, and they produced generously. It was hard not to appreciate a plant that tried so hard, even if you weren't quite sure what to do with it. So, tomatoes became a familiar fixture in American gardens, always present, rarely consumed. Cookbooks of the late 1700s and early 1800s occasionally mention them, but with cautious phrasing. Recipes might describe the tomato's flavor as curious or bold. Some included elaborate steps for cooking, boiling, or masking the taste, as if to protect the eater from something too wild. Others merely said, "can be eaten if necessary." Even in these books, the tomato felt like an afterthought, a flirtation, a dare. And while they sat on sideboards and window ledges, tomatoes began to gather stories. A house guest might claim their cousin in Maryland ate one and felt lightheaded. A neighbor might say that tomato seeds had to be planted during a waning moon, or they'd turn bitter. Someone else might insist that they gave you dreams, not nightmares exactly, but vivid, waking images. Historians still argue whether this delicate dance between fascination and fear had more to do with science or with status. Some suggest that the tomato's avoidance wasn't entirely about poison, but about perception. The idea that eating a tomato was lowly, too rustic, too foreign, too different from the bland, pale foods considered elegant. Perhaps that's why they remained on display. Safer that way, more respectable, easier to control. In this setting, the tomato becomes a kind of performance. It sits day after day, reminding everyone of its potential, ripening slowly, never quite crossing the threshold from admired to accepted. And yet, some people did eat them, usually in secret or among family, without ceremony. Just a bite, a taste, and when nothing happened, they didn't shout it from the rooftops. They simply made space for another tomato the following season. It wasn't a revolution. It was a quiet shift, a gradual tilt toward trust. But for now, as you lie quietly and let the day drift away, the tomato remains more ornament than ingredient. A fruit on a stage, red and round and waiting. The soft light of the candle flickers across its skin, casting tiny shadows in the bowl. It doesn't mind being admired. It's patient. You can almost hear the murmurs around the parlor. So vivid, don't you think? Like a jewel. And somewhere beneath the compliments, beneath the uncertainty, beneath the caution, a kind of longing begins to bloom. A gentle question not spoken aloud, but felt. What if it's not dangerous at all? What if it's delicious? But no one answers. Not yet. The tomato simply waits. The tomato waits, not with impatience, but with a sort of practiced grace. It has waited for centuries, after all. And while it poses quietly on windowsills and in porcelain bowls, something peculiar begins to happen. The name tomato is rarely spoken in the kitchen, but a certain word begins to pass from mouth to mouth, across tables, through recipes. Ketchup, not tomato ketchup, not yet. Just ketchup. You turn toward this strange little twist in the story. The kind of detail that feels like a secret tucked inside an old recipe book, smudged with fingerprints and flecks of something long dried. In early colonial America, long before the tomato found its footing, ketchup was already on the menu. But it wasn't red. It wasn't sweet. It wasn't even made with fruit. The original ketchups, borrowed and adapted from fermented Asian sauces, were savory, thin, and oddly complex. British settlers brought versions made with anchovies, mushrooms, walnuts, oysters, and even unripe fruit. Each one had its own distinct flavor, earthy, briny, pungent, nothing like the bright, sugary condiment we know today. You imagine a quiet kitchen in 1760. A woman leans over a bubbling pot, stirring slowly. The smell is unfamiliar, sharp and rich. She adds a pinch of salt, a splash of vinegar, maybe some cloves. Her handwritten recipe, copied from a friend in England, calls it ketchup. There's not a tomato in sight. In fact, for decades, ketchup existed completely independent of tomatoes. And this is where the story becomes a little ironic. As tomatoes sat nearby, ignored, feared, admired but uneaten, the sauces people made to flavor their meals grew increasingly complex. Mushroom ketchup, in particular, was wildly popular. It was used to enhance meats, flavor stews, even dress fish. It came in bottles with fancy labels and elaborate promises. For the improvement of sauces, for invigorating the palate, for refined households. And still, no tomatoes. Tomato ketchup wouldn't emerge until the early 1800s. And even then, it was met with skepticism. Imagine trying to convince someone to add that fruit, the one you wouldn't dare eat raw, into a sauce meant to season your entire dish. It took a different kind of courage, a different kind of curiosity. Somewhere, someone stirred a pot with both hands and added something no one expected. Crushed tomatoes, not for decoration, not for show, but for flavor. The result? A thick, tangy, vivid red sauce that didn't try to disguise itself. Tomato ketchup had arrived. It didn't explode in popularity overnight. Like the fruit itself, it entered the American kitchen quietly, through small experiments and whispered recommendations. Try this, someone might say, passing a jar across the table. It's unusual, but pleasant. And people did. Some licked their fingers, unsure. Others dipped bread. A few pretended not to like it, then asked for seconds. And gradually, this sauce, made from the once feared fruit, began to earn a place beside salt and pepper. There's something gently poetic about that transformation. The tomato, once a threat, had become a bridge, not just to acceptance, but to delight. But let's linger for a moment longer in the world of non-tomato ketchups. Because even after tomato ketchup began to rise, other versions persisted. Walnut ketchup, in particular, had a loyal following. Oysters, too. Some households swore by mushroom ketchup well into the 19th century, insisting it offered more depth. These sauces weren't trendy. They were earnest, handmade, fermented slowly in ceramic crocks and bottled with pride. They were passed down, shared between neighbors, traded like treasure. And still, the tomato hovered nearby, watching, offering something no one expected: sweetness, brightness, color. You may find it amusing now, curled up in the hush of your evening, to imagine how fiercely people clung to mushroom juice while doubting a tomato. But it makes sense, in its own quiet way. Fear is slow to let go. Habit, even slower. And when a food becomes part of culture, it doesn't always matter what it tastes like. It matters what it means. At the time, ketchup meant something earthy, dark, refined. It was brown or gray or blackish, bottled in glass, often pungent. The idea of it being red, sweet even, that felt strange, childish, maybe less serious, less proper. So, tomato ketchup began, as so many things do, in the margins. Cookbooks included it with cautious notes. A newer variation, they might say, or, for those inclined toward brightness, some recipes added brown sugar to soften the acidity. Others used cinnamon or nutmeg, creating something closer to chutney. Each household tweaked it. Each cook defended their version. It was still a little odd, but less and less so. And once it made its way onto tables, once children asked for it, and guests complimented it, and grocers began stocking jars, the tomato's fate shifted. It was no longer just the subject of gossip, it was in the sauce. That may seem small, but for the tomato, it was a revolution, a change in narrative, a quiet victory. Because now, even those who wouldn't dare eat a raw tomato might still enjoy its essence, disguised, blended, seasoned, palatable, acceptable, a middle ground. Tomato ketchup became a kind of compromise between the fear of the past and the taste of the future, a way to try the fruit without fully committing. A sauce, after all, is less threatening than a bite, and the irony deepens when you realize that, for many people, ketchup became the first way they tasted a tomato. Not the fruit itself, but its softened, seasoned self, a version less wild, more tame. Even today, there are those who don't like raw tomatoes, too slimy, too sharp, too bold, but they'll squeeze a packet of ketchup without a second thought, a lingering echo of hesitation, dressed in sugar and salt. So, tonight, as you drift between thoughts, consider the quiet cleverness of a fruit that found its way onto your plate not by force, but by sweetness, not by confronting your fears, but by slipping in alongside your fries. And tomorrow, when you see that little bottle on your counter, familiar, bright, unbothered, perhaps you'll remember. It wasn't always so welcome, but it waited. The tomato had found its way into sauce. It had simmered in shadow and suggestion, softened by sugar, hidden behind vinegar and spice. But it had not yet stood alone. It had not yet stepped forward, bare and unapologetic, into the mouth of a doubter. That moment, theatrical and strange, whispered about more than written, would come in the form of a single bite, a performance, really, but also a risk, or so it seemed at the time. You walk now along a dusty road. The year is 1820, the town is Salem, New Jersey, and the afternoon is hot, still, and humming with the sound of curious neighbors gathering. Word has spread. A man is going to eat a tomato in public. Not just any man, Colonel Robert Gibbon Johnson, a Revolutionary War veteran, a landowner, a figure of good standing, respected, if a little eccentric. People say he's been talking about tomatoes for years, that he believes in them, cultivates them, defends them, and now, apparently, he plans to eat one in broad daylight. On the courthouse steps, you imagine the townspeople arriving slowly, some with parasols, others with folded arms and skeptical faces. Children lean against their mothers, dogs settle near benches, shopkeepers leave their doors ajar to listen. The mood isn't tense, exactly, but it's charged, like watching someone challenge a ghost. And then, there he is, the colonel, dressed in his formal coat, his white hair neatly combed, eyes sharp with purpose. In one hand, he holds a tomato. It is large, ripe, glossy, and very red. There's a pause, just long enough for everyone to feel it. Then, without fanfare, he bites into it. A soft gasp rolls through the crowd. Some clutch their chests. Others look away, bracing for collapse. Surely he'll choke, foam, fall. Surely the legends are true. No one eats a tomato and walks away. But he does. He chews, swallows, takes another bite, and then another. By the time he's finished the fruit, the crowd is silent in a different way, not from fear, but from confusion. The colonel wipes his mouth, offers a polite nod, and walks back into history. Historians still argue whether this event happened exactly as described. Some say it was embellished over time. Others believe the entire episode was invented decades later to give the tomato a hero. But even if the exact details blur, the meaning remains. Someone, somewhere, did eat a tomato in front of others. And they lived. More importantly, they did it on purpose. It wasn't just survival. It was spectacle. A public unspelling of a long-held fear. And like many myths, once the moment passed without consequence, the myth began to unravel. You can almost feel it. The way stories change when one piece falls out of place. The grandmother who told you never to eat them now hesitates. The neighbor who swore tomatoes caused fever looks unsure. And the fruit, still warm on the vine, suddenly feels less like a threat and more like a possibility. Colonel Johnson's bite didn't erase generations of suspicion overnight, but it cracked the surface. And that was enough. What followed was a slow and savory bloom. Gardeners began to speak more openly of their tomato crops. Cooks experimented without apology. Recipes emerged with confidence. Stewed tomatoes, baked tomatoes, tomato pies. Families passed around seeds with pride rather than secrecy. The tomato, once feared and ornamental, became food, real food, shared and celebrated, and all because someone dared to eat one, not in private, but under the sun. You might smile now, tucked in the folds of your blankets, thinking how much of human history turns not on grand discoveries or declarations, but on quiet acts of defiance. A woman planting a forbidden seed, a child licking a spoon, a man taking a bite. It's not just about the tomato. It never was. It's about the courage to challenge the stories we inherit, the ones whispered from porch to pulpit, scribbled in margins and etched into habit. Sometimes, those stories protect us. but sometimes they hold us back from flavor, from truth, from joy. The tomato had waited so long for this moment, not for the bite itself, but for the shift that would follow, a shift in tone, in memory, in taste, and perhaps it knew, in whatever way plants can know, that it didn't need to defend itself with facts, just flavor. Once people tasted it, really tasted it, the battle was won. But still, it wasn't immediate. Even after Johnson's dramatic bite, even after cookbooks started adding tomato chapters, some households clung to caution, not out of fear anymore, but out of habit, out of identity, out of a belief that if something was long considered bad, then surely it must still be bad, at least a little. It's a feeling you've likely known, too, in food, or people, or ideas. That strange hesitation just before you try something new, that pause at the threshold of change. But eventually, enough people crossed it. And the tomato? It crossed too, not with fanfare this time, but with confidence. It moved from windowsill to salad, from centerpiece to sauce, from curiosity to comfort, from feared to familiar, all because someone took a bite and didn't die. So, as your breath softens and your eyelids grow heavier, you might imagine the sound of that bite echoing across centuries. Not loud, but lasting. A crisp little crunch that said, in the gentlest way possible, "You were wrong about me. And now, you know better." The bite had been taken. The fruit had been swallowed. The man, to everyone's surprise, had remained upright. He even walked home, they say, whistling. The tomato had survived its trial by suspicion. But that was only the beginning. You now find yourself in a small apothecary, tucked beside a quiet lane sometime in the mid-1800s. The air smells like camphor and dust, and every surface is cluttered with bottles. Small handwritten labels peek from shelves, ink faded and curling at the edges. Cough tonic, liver salts, powdered willow bark, and somewhere, in between the more familiar remedies, is something a little unexpected. Tomato pills? Yes, tomato pills. After centuries of being feared as poison, the tomato, almost overnight, began to be rebranded as medicine. It's a soft sort of irony, isn't it? One moment, people are afraid to even taste it, and the next, they're swallowing it on purpose, hoping it might heal them. And perhaps it wasn't so surprising. Once the fear had been punctured, not eradicated, but softened, people began to look at the tomato differently. No longer a threat, it now appeared powerful, maybe even useful. In an era before regulated pharmaceuticals, the tomato offered something delightfully ambiguous. It was natural, bright, strange enough to feel potent. And now that it was no longer forbidden, it held new promise for those eager to find the next great cure-all. You watch as a thin man in a waistcoat picks up a bottle and reads the label aloud. Dr. Miles's extract of tomato for ailments of the liver, the bowels, and the blood. He squints, considers, and drops a few coins on the counter. After all, what harm could it do? That's the question that opened the floodgates. Soon, tomato-based tonics and pills appeared everywhere. Advertisements claimed they could purify the blood, cure indigestion, treat dysentery, ease melancholy. One popular formula even promised to restore vigor to the constitution, a phrase vague enough to mean whatever a customer wanted it to. People drank tomato juice as a tonic. They cooked it into broths described as restorative. Some even swore by tomato poultices, soft mash wrapped in cloth and pressed to the skin to draw out fever. The tomato had gone from forbidden fruit to folk remedy, and no one seemed entirely sure how it had happened. It didn't matter. The shift had already taken root. In some ways, this was how the tomato finally made its way into daily life, not through recipes, but through remedies, through the promise that it could help you. It was no longer just safe to eat, it was desirable. Even newspapers got in on it, publishing columns on the new health fruit. Tomato-rich diets were praised for keeping the body regular, for improving the skin, for boosting one's mood. Physicians, or at least those who called themselves physicians, began recommending tomatoes in what we might today call therapeutic doses. A tomato, a day keeps the apothecary away. That wasn't the phrase, of course, but it might as well have been. Still, as you trace your fingers along the smooth edges of a dream-laced memory, you sense the lingering hesitation in some corners. Not everyone was convinced. The idea of eating tomatoes as medicine was easier to accept than as food. Taking something in pill form felt safer, more controlled, less messy. And so, a curious paradox emerged. People were consuming tomatoes without really eating them. They swallowed pills made from pulp, drank strained juices in measured ounces, dipped spoons into syrups made with salt, vinegar, and fire. But biting into a fresh tomato, that still felt too bold for many. There's a certain comfort in processing things, isn't there? In drying, grinding, bottling, cooking, in transforming the unfamiliar into something manageable, easier to control, easier to understand. The raw tomato, after all, was still strange. Its skin was taut, but not tough. Its insides were soft, but not sweet. The texture confused people. Too wet, too fragile, too alive. And so, the pill offered relief, a way to participate without confronting the full tomato-ness of it all. You may smile now, thinking of all the tomato skeptics who unknowingly embraced the fruit by swallowing it in capsule form. The very same people who once wrinkled their noses at a tomato slice on a sandwich. But time, as always, has a way of nudging things along. By the mid-1800s, tomatoes were appearing not just in bottles and apothecaries, but in home kitchens. Slowly, they made their way into soups and salads, into sauces and pies. Cooks began to trust their color. Children began to request them. Grandparents, the very ones who once issued warnings, began to say, well, maybe just a taste. And still, the tomato pills remained. They were sold in traveling medicine wagons, hawked at fairs, recommended in the back pages of almanacs. They were the tomato's final disguise, its last protective costume before standing fully in the light of the American table. Historians still debate whether these pills did anything useful at all. Most agree they were, at best, mildly helpful and, at worst, harmless nonsense. But their real power wasn't in the healing, it was in the framing. They reframed the tomato not as a threat, but as an ally, a helper, a healer, a fruit worth trusting. And isn't that what most of us long for in unfamiliar things? Not certainty, but a reason to hope, not full understanding, but a gentle nudge toward yes. Tonight, as your thoughts slow and your breathing deepens, the image of those tiny bottles may linger in your mind, resting on a wooden shelf, carefully labeled, quietly hopeful. Not a cure, but maybe a beginning. The bottles have gone quiet. The pills have softened into memory. The labels have faded, curled at the corners, and slipped into drawers long forgotten. But the tomato remains, a fruit slowly stepping out of its disguise, wearing less and less caution with each passing year. And now, it finds itself in a place where caution has little room to survive. The year is 1863. The United States is at war with itself. You drift gently into a camp beneath pale morning light. The canvas tents are damp with dew. The smell of firewood and wool lingers in the air. Soldiers shift in their sleep, boots placed like makeshift pillows. rifles resting quietly nearby. This is the world of the Civil War, gritty, uncertain, weary. Here, food is not about elegance or fashion, it's about survival, calories, shelf life, simplicity. There is no time to debate whether a fruit is decorative or dangerous. The stomach rules now, and the tomato, quite suddenly, becomes useful. Canned food, still a novelty only a few decades earlier, finds a new purpose on the battlefield. Tin-plated steel containers, sealed with care, begin to carry not just beans and salted pork, but something tangy, red, and remarkably resilient: stewed tomatoes. You picture a soldier sitting cross-legged on the dirt, a battered spoon in one hand, a dented tin in the other. He pries it open, steam rising faintly into the cool air. The tomato mixture inside is simple: boiled, salted, maybe touched with a little sugar or vinegar. But after weeks of hardtack and jerky, it tastes like sunlight. There are no fancy labels here, no warnings, no arguments about nightshade. The tomato, stripped of its mystery, is simply food. And for many soldiers, this is the first time they've truly tasted it. Not as a sauce, not as a syrup, not hidden behind a pill or a parlor game, but warm, real, honest, eaten with fatigue, eaten with gratitude. It's strange to think that war, so often a force of destruction, might offer the tomato its most practical invitation to the American table. But that's how it goes. Sometimes, crisis changes what we're willing to try. It silences the whispers and clears space for what simply works. The soldiers, of course, don't call it a turning point. They just eat. But when they return home, something comes with them. A taste remembered, a fruit redefined. You follow that taste through letters written home, brief, scrawled notes full of longing and mud and tomatoes. Some write of them as a rare treat. Others joke that they're tired of them. But none write in fear. None say, "We were poisoned." That part of the story is fading. And back on the home front, canned tomatoes begin to appear in pantries. Their practicality is hard to ignore. They're cheap. They last. They go with everything: meats, grains, even bread. Recipes adapt to them. Families adjust around them. Children grow up knowing them not as a myth, but as a staple. The tomato, it seems, has finally crossed a threshold. But it isn't just logistics that win people over. It's familiarity, repetition, the comfort of something that appears again and again. Quietly dependable. You don't fear what you eat during hardship. You remember it. You hold on to it. And if it tastes like survival, eventually, it starts to taste like home. Of course, some suspicion still lingers, especially in isolated communities or among older generations who remember the rumors. You might hear the occasional murmur at a dinner table, "I still don't trust them raw," or "My grandmother never touched one." But these are the final embers of a fear long cooled, because the Civil War did something tomato pills and parlor displays couldn't quite accomplish. It normalized the tomato in a way that felt ordinary, not exotic, not medicinal, not theatrical, just food. And ordinary, in this case, was revolutionary. You can almost picture the transition unfolding, one household at a time. A mother uses canned tomatoes in stew because it's what she has. Her child grows up thinking that flavor belongs. A neighbor borrows a recipe. A church cookbook includes it. A picnic features tomato sandwiches. And just like that, the fruit that once symbolized danger becomes something too familiar to question. It helps, too, that by this time, tomato cultivation has spread far and wide. Different varieties pop up in gardens across the country. Small, large, sweet, acidic. Names like Brandywine, Trophy, and Early Anna begin to appear in seed catalogs. Farmers market them proudly. gardeners trade them, children plant them for school fairs. The tomato doesn't just survive now, it thrives. Still, if you listen closely, in the quiet corner of a porch or a pantry, you might hear an old story resurface, a warning remembered, a tale retold half laughing, half serious. You know, they used to think these were poison, and someone, a child, maybe, will gasp, wide-eyed and delighted, because what once was a fear has become a story, a bedtime curiosity, a soft and satisfying surprise. And the tomato, ever patient, ever ripening, has found its place, not through argument or revolution, but through presence, through flavor, through need, tonight. As your thoughts drift through gardens and tents and tin cans, let yourself rest in the sweetness of that truth. Some things don't have to fight for attention. They just have to stay. Stay long enough, grow deep enough, be tasted enough, and eventually the fear fades, and what's left is trust. The soldiers have returned home, and with them, the tomato. No longer the parlor room curiosity or the whispered hazard. It has become something quiet and constant, stored on shelves, simmered in stews, folded into family suppers. But the story doesn't stop at rations or war. It finds new life in another space entirely. The kitchen, not the grand kitchens of estates, nor the crowded fire pits of makeshift camps, but the narrow, humming kitchens of ordinary homes, where aprons are tied, soup spoons clatter, and sunlight filters through gingham curtains. Here, the tomato begins its next act. You enter one such kitchen now. It is 1887. A woman stands by the window, drying her hands on a cotton towel. Her hair is pinned up, her cheeks flushed from steam. A jar rests on the counter beside her, glass, filled with bright red pieces swimming in their own soft juice. It glows like a ruby in the morning light. She has canned these tomatoes herself. Canning, still a relatively new practice in American homes, has become a point of both pride and practicality. For the first time, people can preserve the abundance of summer and carry it into the gray, lean months of winter. And tomatoes, soft, generous, and acid bright, are perfect candidates. The woman carefully tightens the lid, listening for the faintest pop of pressure. She lines the jar beside its companions on a shelf. 24 quarts so far, maybe 30 by week's end. Canning isn't just food storage, it's memory making, a quiet assertion of control in a world still shaped by chance, by weather, by illness, by distance, and within that glass jar, the tomato becomes more than a fruit. It becomes security, nourishment, planning made visible, and yes, transformation. Because when you preserve something, you change how it's remembered. You change how it's trusted. For housewives of the late 19th century, tomatoes are both comfort and experiment. Cookbooks offer recipes with poetic names: tomato marmalade, sun-kissed relish, Mrs. Whitmore's famous stew. The instructions are filled with terms like blanch, scald, and seal tightly, and often accompanied by hand-drawn illustrations of cheerful tomatoes beside blooming herbs. Not every attempt is perfect. Some jars don't seal, some ferment, some simply taste strange. But the rhythm of trying again, of boiling, pouring, sealing, becomes a part of household life. And with each successful jar, the tomato's image changes. In some kitchens, the tomato is still met with a raised eyebrow, especially from older generations who remember when it sat only in the garden, never on the plate. But more often, that suspicion fades under the gentle weight of routine. If you've eaten it for a year, 2 years, 5, and nothing has happened, maybe it isn't dangerous after all. You picture a young mother offering stewed tomatoes to her toddler, scooping them into a bowl beside warm cornbread. The child doesn't know the history, the fear, the whispers, the ornamental years. The child just knows it tastes like home. And so, a new association forms. Not poison, not mystery, but comfort. By now, canned tomatoes are appearing not only in homes, but in stores, packed in tins with colorful labels and brand names meant to inspire confidence. Sunfield, Harvest Crown, Pure Red. They are advertised in newspapers alongside hand soap and sewing needles. Some companies boast that their tomatoes are picked and packed the same day, as if to say, no danger here, only freshness. And housewives, often the primary decision makers of the home kitchen, begin to wield quiet power. They choose what to buy, what to cook, what to trust, and increasingly, they choose the tomato. It helps that tomatoes are versatile. They fit into nearly every kind of dish: soups, casseroles, preserves, sauces. They bridge sweet and savory. They can be roasted, raw, chilled, or baked. There's something deeply satisfying about a food that offers itself in so many ways. Still, there's a kind of gentle amusement in the way tomato recipes are often written during this time, with caveats, alternatives, and plenty of encouragement. If unsure of the flavor, serve with bread. To tame acidity, add a pinch of sugar. Pairs well with onions, but not too many. These are not declarations. They are invitations. The tomato, still shedding the last traces of suspicion, is offered with kindness and caution, and in return, it is slowly embraced. Women write letters to one another, exchanging recipes and tricks. Add cloves, one suggests. Use them green, writes another. Tomato-based relishes and preserves become staples at potlucks and church suppers. The fruit that once sat untouched on sideboards is now spread on biscuits and spooned into soups. Historians still argue whether the real acceptance of the tomato came from science, taste, or necessity. But in many ways, it was women, curious, careful, collaborative, who turned the tide through quiet experiments, through whispered advice, through generational sharing. The tomato was made safe not by proclamation, but by practice. And perhaps that's the most powerful kind of trust, the kind that's earned over time, one jar at a time, one meal at a time. You breathe in now, the scent of simmered tomato, and time lingering like a soft lullaby. You imagine that same woman, hands dusted with flour, apron streaked with juice, placing a bowl of tomato soup on the table. Her family gathers. No one hesitates, not anymore. The fruit has come in from the cold. It is no longer questioned. It is simply there, bright, warm, ready. And on shelves across the country, row after row of jars gleam in quiet victory. The jars glisten softly in their rows. You can almost hear them settle with the cooling of the afternoon, lids clicking shut with satisfaction. The tomato has found its way into the rhythm of domestic life, measured, trusted, ordinary. But even as housewives seal their jars and children lick tomato gravy from wooden spoons, a quieter storm is brewing elsewhere, not in the kitchen, but in the courtroom. Because in the strange and tangled dance between food, law, and commerce, the tomato must face one final identity crisis, one so peculiar, so oddly bureaucratic, that it sounds more like satire than history. You're sitting in a courtroom now. The year is 1893. The room smells faintly of varnished wood, ink, and starch. You shift slightly on a stiff bench, watching as two men prepare their arguments. Their suits are crisp, their expressions solemn. One stands beside a barrel of tomatoes, the other beside a tax ledger. And what's at stake today isn't whether the tomato is safe. It's whether it's a fruit or a vegetable. That's right. After centuries of confusion, ornamentation, hesitation, and eventual delight, the tomato now finds itself in the hands of lawyers and justices, not over poison or potion, but over import tax. It begins, as many such things do, with money. In the late 1800s, the United States imposes a tariff on vegetables imported from abroad, a tax intended to protect domestic farmers. Fruits, however, remain untaxed. And so, a New York merchant named John Nix, importing tomatoes from the West Indies, argues that he shouldn't be charged. Tomatoes, after all, are botanically fruits. They grow from a flower. They carry seeds inside. Every scientist agrees. The dictionary agrees. Even most gardeners agree. But the customs collector says no. He insists that tomatoes are vegetables and thus taxable, not based on their botanical classification, but on how they're used, on how people eat them. This small disagreement makes its way through legal channels, gaining attention, gathering lawyers, and eventually arriving at the U.S. Supreme Court. Yes, the highest court in the country will now weigh in on the tomato. You can't help but smile, listening from your perch on the courtroom bench. It all feels wonderfully absurd. The justices, robed, dignified, deliberate, must now debate a question that has likely never crossed their minds. Is the tomato a fruit or a vegetable? Arguments are made. Definitions are read aloud. One attorney produces a cookbook, thumbing to the index to show that tomatoes are listed under vegetables. Another references grocery lists, noting that people buy tomatoes alongside cabbage and turnips, not peaches or plums. The botanical truth is acknowledged, yes. The tomato is technically a fruit, but in the eyes of the law, practicality wins. And so, in 1893, the Supreme Court rules in Nix v. In. Heading that, for tariff purposes, the tomato is legally a vegetable, not because it grows like one, but because people use it like one. Historians still shake their heads at the ruling, not because it's incorrect, necessarily, but because it represents the strange divide between scientific fact and cultural habit. The truth, as it often does, depends on context. But for the tomato, it's another turning point, a moment where its identity is formally debated, examined, and ultimately decided by human ritual. It is no longer an object of mystery or suspicion. Now, it's a subject of policy, a food so common, so integrated, that it must be classified not for safety, but for paperwork. You may be smiling under your blanket now, picturing a courtroom full of serious faces debating something you sliced onto your sandwich this morning. But there's something quietly profound in it, too. The tomato, once banned from the plate, now inspires legal definitions. It's no longer fighting for a place at the table. It owns one. And now the question is not if we eat it, but how we name it. This matters more than it seems, because how we name things, how we frame them, shapes what we believe. The tomato's journey from forbidden fruit to canned staple, from poison to pantry, from love apple to legal vegetable. It's a journey shaped not just by flavor, but by narrative. The courtroom becomes, in its way, a theater, and the tomato, after centuries of waiting in the wings, has earned a leading role. Of course, the ruling doesn't change much in the lives of most Americans. Housewives still can their tomatoes. Children still refuse to eat them. Farmers still plant them by the acre. But something subtle shifts, a recognition, perhaps, that the tomato is no longer unusual. It's normal, mundane, even, and that, in many ways, is the greatest victory. You can almost hear the rustling of recipe cards now, new ones, typed or written in careful script. Tomato aspic, creamed tomatoes on toast, tomato and onion salad, Dishes that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier are now appearing in cookbooks and weekly columns with cheerful confidence. The tomato isn't just accepted, it's expected. And though the court ruling may seem silly in retrospect, it marks the end of something, the final bureaucratic curtain call for a fruit that once wore too many disguises. Tonight, as your thoughts quiet and your breath slows, let yourself drift into the gentle rhythm of that transformation, from feared to framed, from question to answer, from love apple to lawful vegetable. The tomato, after all this time, has nothing left to prove, only flavor to offer, and maybe a little paperwork to file. The courtroom has quieted now. The decision is made. The tomato, once a botanical question mark, has become a legal vegetable, not because of science, but because of soup. And with that verdict, it seems like the tomato's long battle for belonging is over. But history has a habit of looping back on itself, just when things appear to settle. You find yourself in a grocery shop in the early 20th century. The lighting is dim, filtered through dusty windows. Shelves are lined with tins wrapped in colorful labels: beans, sardines, peaches, corn, and, proudly, tomatoes. Canned tomatoes have become a staple now, reliable, accessible. Families trust them, reach for them, stack them 3 high in pantries with quiet satisfaction. But beneath that confidence, a new kind of whisper begins to circulate. This time, it isn't about poison from nature, it's about poison from man. You see, with the rise of industrial canning came the slow spread of something else: concern. The early 1900s was an era of progress, but also of anxiety. People were beginning to ask questions about the things they ate, and for the first time in history, they weren't simply cooking food, they were buying it, sealed, processed, and labeled by someone far away. The tomato, now stripped of mystery, becomes entangled again, not in folklore, but in food safety scandals. It begins quietly, with murmurs about spoiled tins, the occasional report of illness, a child who falls sick after soup, a housewife who opens a can and smells something foul. The word botulism begins to creep into newspapers, sounding more like a foreign spell than a disease. Few understand what it means. Fewer still know how it works. But it is linked, somehow, to cans and to tomatoes. The Great Tomato Scare, as it will come to be called, is not one event, but a slow burn, a wave of unease that passes through households and headlines from roughly 1906 to 1915. It never erupts into panic. It never becomes a national crisis, but it settles into people's bones, as fear often does, quiet and vague, but persistent. You picture a woman standing in her kitchen, tin opener in hand, pausing before she pierces the lid. She presses her ear to the can, as if listening for a hiss of warning. She sniffs the edge after opening. She stirs slowly. And when her child says, "Is this the tomato kind?" she hesitates before answering. It isn't the tomato itself people distrust, not anymore, but the handling of it, the canning factories, the men in coats and gloves who stuff tomatoes into machines, who seal the lids, who load the crates. What if they weren't clean? What if they hurried? What if the tomatoes were too old? What if something slipped through? The tomato, so long burdened by old fears, now shoulders new ones. And as public trust in processed food wavers, the government takes notice. In 1906, Congress passes the Pure Food and Drug Act, the first federal law to regulate food labeling and safety. The law is prompted by growing unease not only about tomatoes, but about meat, milk, candy, and everything in between. It doesn't solve the problem overnight, but it begins to restore confidence. Canning methods improve, labels become clearer, factories are inspected, and in time, the fear begins to ease. Still, the tomato is marked again, not deeply, but enough to leave a smudge, a reminder that trust, once earned, can always be questioned, that no food is ever entirely safe from suspicion, not even one that has survived witches, pewter plates, gossiping gardeners, and courtroom definitions. Historians still argue about how widespread the tomato scare truly was, whether it was a media invention or a real public sentiment. But the lesson it left behind is undeniable. You don't need myth to make people nervous. You just need uncertainty. And the tomato, so long defined by it, absorbs this new version with the same quiet resilience. It continues to appear in recipes, in stores, in school lunches, but now there are precautions. Boil before serving, discard if bulging, store in a cool, dry place. The language of caution becomes part of the label, and the home cook, once again, becomes the final judge. You picture her, brow slightly furrowed, hands steady, senses alert. She tastes, she waits, she serves, and the meal goes on. It's strange how the tomato, by this point, has come full circle. Once feared for what it might do naturally, now feared for what might be done to it. Always on the edge of suspicion, always one step away from confidence. But perhaps that's part of its charm. The tomato has never been boring. It's never been passive. It has demanded attention, whether through color, caution, or controversy. Even during the scare, some took advantage of its resilience. Garden clubs encourage women to grow and can their own tomatoes, offering reassurance through self-sufficiency. From vine to jar, they promised. No mystery, no middleman. Seed companies leaned into the moment too, advertising tomatoes as pure, American-grown, home-honored, and in doing so, the tomato became more than a food again. It became a symbol of vigilance, of independence, of the ongoing dance between trust and doubt. Tonight, as your thoughts grow slower, you might imagine a pantry shelf in 1912. The jars are lined up neatly. Their contents glow softly in the low light, each one sealed by hand, tested by taste, offered with care. And maybe that's how we finally made peace with the tomato, not by ignoring our fears, but by learning how to manage them, not by pretending food is perfect, but by learning what to look for, how to prepare, how to trust. The tomato doesn't mind. It has been questioned before. It has been doubted, examined, put on trial. And still, it stays, ripening quietly, ready when you are. The scare begins to fade, slowly and softly, like morning mist lifting from a field. Trust, that delicate thing, returns on tiptoe, never loudly, never all at once, but it returns, and with it, the tomato begins to change again, not in substance, but in image, because now, the fruit once feared finds itself in a new kind of spotlight, one that gleams not from a kitchen lamp or a pantry shelf, but from a camera lens. You're no longer in a homey kitchen or a Civil War camp. Now, the air is drier, the sun is sharper. You've arrived in California, where citrus groves stretch out like patchwork, and where, surprisingly, tomatoes begin to flirt with something they've never known before: fame. It starts simply, as many things in Hollywood do. In the 1920s and 30s, food begins to play a different role in American life, no longer just fuel or medicine. It becomes a symbol, a product, an image to be sold, not for what it does, but for what it says about you. And in that landscape, the tomato, with its rich color and quiet controversy, makes for good press. You imagine an old advertisement in a black and white magazine. A glamorous actress, reclining on a fainting couch, holds a tomato in one hand. Her nails are polished, her dress silk, her gaze wistful. The caption reads, "Youth in every bite." It's not about vitamins, it's about allure. And suddenly, tomatoes, once accused of sorcery, now accused of sensuality, begin to appear everywhere, in film stills, in cooking segments, in lifestyle spreads. They are sliced beside white linen napkins, garnished on plates of perfectly seared steaks, and perched delicately on summer picnic blankets. They are no longer threatening, they are charming, they sparkle. Hollywood, always eager for symbolism, quickly adopts the tomato as more than food. It becomes a metaphor. By the 1940s, calling a woman a real tomato becomes slang, dated now and rightly retired, but once meant to describe someone bold, fresh, perhaps a little too much. It was meant as a compliment, sort of. The tomato's shape, round, vivid, unapologetic, made it a kind of shorthand for youthful energy, confidence, femininity, and just like that, the fruit that once prompted sermons and science experiments now slips into scripts and slang. You might be smiling now, imagining the tomato's journey from feared to flirtatious, from "don't eat that" to "isn't she something?" And underneath the humor lies a strange and tender truth, that what we once fear, we sometimes later admire, that the things we keep at a distance can become the things we celebrate, once we let them in. But the tomato wasn't just a symbol of beauty or boldness, it also became a symbol of Americana. In the post-war years, as suburban life bloomed and television entered living rooms, the tomato took its place on glossy cookbook covers and family dinner tables, bright red wedges on iceberg lettuce, sliced into white bread sandwiches, floating in cheerful gelatin molds. Tomatoes were part of the American dream now, clean, reliable, ready to serve. Hollywood helped reinforce that image. In cooking shows and commercials, tomatoes were handled with affection. "Look at that color," a host might sigh. "Perfect for tonight's dinner." Housewives smiled as they stuffed them with tuna salad. Chefs carved roses from their skins. Children held them like baseballs, ripe and warm from summer gardens. Even cartoon characters weren't immune. Tomatoes became props in food fights, in slapstick sketches, objects so familiar, so non-threatening. They could be hurled without guilt. In animation, they exploded in a satisfying splat, always met with laughter. And isn't that something? A fruit once feared as deadly, now thrown for sport. Historians still marvel at the tomato's makeover, from menace to metaphor, from accused to adored. But perhaps it was always destined for drama. No quiet apple or bashful bean could have played so many roles. Only the tomato, rich, red, unignorable, could shift from poison to pinup. You wander now into a prop room somewhere in 1950s Hollywood. Shelves stacked with wax fruit. A bowl of plastic tomatoes sits beneath a dusty spotlight. A makeup artist walks by and pauses, plucks one from the bowl, tosses it playfully in the air, and places it on set. No one gasps, no one shudders, no one fears the tomato anymore. Instead, it's part of the visual vocabulary, a bit player in the big picture, but also a quiet reminder of how far it's come. A story that never needed rewriting, only re-seeing. Because even in Hollywood, even in a place built on reinvention, the tomato didn't have to change what it was. It just had to wait for us to catch up. It's tempting to imagine the tomato smiling now, if it could, smiling at its own strange arc. From garden ghost to grocery staple to glamorized garnish. And maybe that's what we love most. Not just that it's good, but that it's earned its goodness, that it's come through suspicion and satire and sauce and still arrived, intact, on our plates, tonight. As you lie back and let the hush of sleep settle over you, Let your thoughts drift gently through a montage of tomato moments, the old tin labels, the war camp spoons, the shining jars, the soft click of a film reel, a sigh from a silver screen chef, and somewhere in the distance, a warm garden glows beneath California sun. Rows and rows of tomatoes nodding on the vine, no longer fearing the gaze, but basking in it. The tomato is no longer in hiding. It has strutted across kitchen counters, stood tall in backyard gardens, and smiled from behind the glass of glitzy grocery store aisles. And just when it seems its story has reached its sweet, ripe conclusion, just when the tomato is finally free from misunderstanding, it takes one last theatrical turn, one last laugh, one more dance with absurdity. Because the tomato does not just survive scandal and superstition, it gets its own horror film. You feel it before you see it, that familiar hum of mid-century Americana, the flickering of film reels, the low-budget charm of drive-in theaters and cardboard monsters. It's 1978, and America is feeling nostalgic, a little chaotic, and hungry for something silly. Enter Attack of the Killer Tomatoes. Yes, that's the real title. You picture a teenager in a rumpled seat, popcorn resting on their lap, as a bright red tomato rolls ominously across the screen. Not just one tomato, dozens, hundreds. All of them somehow evil, or at least determined. They bounce down city streets, they creep under doors, they lurch toward terrified citizens with all the menace of a child's wind-up toy. It's parody, of course, pure satire, a send-up of monster movies, Cold War anxiety, and our odd relationship with the things we eat. But in its own campy way, it marks a moment, one final transformation in the tomato's long public journey. Because to spoof something, to laugh at it without fear, is to declare it safe. In this film, no one warns of curses or botulism or botanical classifications. There's no sermon, no science, no suspicion, only laughter, and yet that laughter carries echoes, a wink to history, a nod to everything the tomato has endured. You lean back into the folds of your imagination, letting the credits roll. The music is ridiculous. The costumes are even worse. But the point is made. The tomato, once too dangerous to touch, now plays the villain in a joke. And the audience loves it. It doesn't end there. The film spawns sequels, spoofs, a Saturday morning cartoon, action figures, t-shirts, a musical. The tomato becomes camp royalty, the kind of character whose ridiculousness makes it beloved. And in that odd cultural moment, something beautiful happens. People start talking about tomatoes again. Not just the silly ones on screen, but the real ones. Garden tomatoes, store-bought tomatoes, heirloom tomatoes with names like Mortgage Lifter and Green Zebra. Suddenly, the fruit is once again in conversation, not because of fear, but because of fun. Children giggle as they imagine tomatoes plotting world domination. Parents chuckle, remembering when their grandparents once called the fruit forbidden. Everyone, in their own way, participates in the rewriting and retelling of the tomato's legacy. Even the agricultural world plays along. Tomato festivals pop up across the country, parades, pie-eating contests, beauty pageants where the crown is shaped like a tomato. It's celebration wrapped in silliness, and silliness wrapped in affection. You can almost hear the summer music now, brass bands and carnival laughter, the squelch of a tomato fight in the town square, as people run gleefully through clouds of red pulp. No one thinks of curses. No one mutters nightshade. They just laugh. They just throw. They just enjoy. Historians might smirk, tracing the line from fear to farce, from superstition to spoof. But it's not just a cultural joke. It's a kind of release, a shared letting go. Because when we can laugh at what once terrified us, we transform it. We remove its power. We bring it back into our world, softer, sillier, safer. And the tomato, round and ready, has never minded being the punchline, not as long as it gets to be on stage. But even in comedy, there's meaning. The film, absurd though it is, touches something familiar. The idea that ordinary things, soft things, bright things, trusted things, might suddenly turn against us. That's what makes it funny. That's what makes it work. It plays with the memory of suspicion, long buried but not forgotten. And in doing so, it reminds us just how far we've come. From witches and lead poisoning, to casseroles and cartoons, from fear to feature films. You might chuckle under your breath now, tucked beneath a warm blanket, imagining a tomato rolling through your neighborhood with ominous music behind it. A fruit with nothing but a stem, a round belly, and a grudge. But you know better. You've followed this story too long to fall for that again. The tomato is not a monster. It never was. It was misunderstood, misnamed, misjudged, but it never lashed out. It only waited to be planted, picked, tasted, waited for the fear to pass, waited to be welcomed, even if that welcome came in the form of a low-budget sci-fi parody. And perhaps that's the lesson buried inside the laughter, that trust takes time, and sometimes humor is the final step in healing, because when we stop fearing something, we start playing with it. And when we start playing with it, we let it in. Tonight, as the fictional tomatoes finish their attack and the credits roll one last time, let yourself smile with them. Not at them, but with them. Because even in silliness, there is resolution. Even in a spoof, there is respect. And the tomato, so long questioned, so often cast aside, now sits in the spotlight, red, ripe, and grinning. The laughter has faded now, but a pleasant warmth remains, the kind that lingers after a shared joke, after a summer festival, after a strange little film has played its final scene. The tomato has made peace with the public. It has danced through gardens, kitchens, courts, and theaters. It has been feared, judged, eaten, admired, and even laughed at. But its story isn't quite done. Because even today, in the soft clatter of grocery carts, in the quiet flip of recipe books, in the hum of backyard barbecues, the tomato still inspires debate, not loud arguments, nothing that keeps anyone up at night, just that familiar rustle of curiosity, a gentle disagreement between neighbors, chefs, scientists, and seed collectors. The tomato, ever patient, listens. You find yourself now in a small farmer's market. The air smells like sun-warmed herbs and wood-framed baskets. Tables brim with fruits and vegetables that seem to have tumbled from a painting. And then you see them, tomatoes in every color, deep crimson, golden yellow, purple with green stripes, some shaped like hearts, others like tiny lanterns, some with names that sound like fairy tale characters, Cherokee purple, Brandywine, Sweet 100, green zebra. A vendor gestures to them with pride. Heirlooms, they say, as if whispering a secret. Heirloom tomatoes have become the modern marvel of the produce world, unaltered by commercial breeding, passed down through generations. Their seeds tell stories. They're rich in flavor, yes, but also in memory, in defiance, in complexity, and yet, not everyone agrees. In the supermarkets just down the road, rows of perfectly red, perfectly round tomatoes sit neatly stacked, identical as marbles. They travel well, last longer, slice cleanly, but some say they taste like nothing. A soft, silent protest lives in every bite. You stand between the two worlds now, the vibrant irregularity of heirlooms and the polished uniformity of commercial hybrids. Both are tomatoes. Both feed millions. But one sings louder, stranger, sweeter, still. Others insist it's not about looks or labels. It's about science. Because somewhere in a greenhouse, nestled among LED lights and humming machines, scientists are mapping tomato genes with astonishing precision. They're tinkering with ripening times, enhancing resistance to disease, and adjusting texture to better suit shipping crates. One tomato is being bred to resist drought, another to hold its shape in sandwiches, another to have more lycopene, more antioxidants, more something. The tomato is no longer simply grown, it's engineered, and that too stirs debate. Is it progress or is it distance? A step forward or one more step away from what tomatoes used to be? Unruly, sun-warmed, plucked by hand? You hear voices on both sides. The scientist speaks of food security, the farmer speaks of soil, the chef speaks of flavor. The shopper just wants something that doesn't bruise on the way home. And beneath all the conversations is one quieter truth. The tomato still holds meaning. Not fear, this time, but something gentler. A tug toward choice, toward memory, toward connection. Even the legal debates haven't fully ended. You might smile to know that botanists still raise their hands politely at conferences, reminding the world that, yes, tomatoes are fruits. Meanwhile, cooks and lawmakers nod patiently and reply. But for the kitchen, for customs, for taxes, their vegetables, the same old question. But now, it's playful, familiar, a handshake, not a courtroom duel. Historians still argue whether the great tomato debates of the past left a permanent imprint on American food culture, or whether they were just passing quirks in a much larger story of agriculture. But there's no denying this. Few foods have lived as many lives. And maybe that's what makes the tomato so quietly powerful. It isn't flashy, it doesn't boast, but it adapts, it waits. It survives being misunderstood, misnamed, mishandled, and still returns each season with color and scent and juice that stains your fingers. You picture a child, maybe your grandchild, walking into the garden barefoot, their hands brush the leaves, warm from the sun. They pluck a tomato still heavy with morning dew, bite into it before anyone can say, "Wash it first." Juice runs down their chin. They giggle. They don't care if it's heirloom or hybrid, organic or hydroponic. To them, it's just good. And in that moment, tomato in hand, sun in their hair, the fruit is exactly what it has always wanted to be. Loved. Not because it is perfect or famous or genetically superior, but because it is theirs, yours too. The tomato no longer needs to prove anything. It has passed every test, sailed across oceans, survived whispers of witchcraft and ridicule from satirical cinema. It has been pickled, peeled, pressed, and praised. It has spilled into recipes, traditions, metaphors, and debates. And yet it remains red or yellow or green, soft or firm, sweet or tart, still here, still waiting, and still, somehow, at the center of our tables and our imaginations. Tonight, as your eyes grow heavier and the rhythm of your breath slows with the hush of sleep, you may carry the tomato with you, not the science, not the law, not even the debate, just the image of a fruit that waited patiently, quietly, and with quiet dignity, until we were finally ready to accept it. A fruit that never needed to shout, just grow. And now, here you are, at the gentle edge of the story, where everything slows, even time itself. The air is still, the garden is quiet, and the tomato, once feared, once mocked, once misunderstood, rests comfortably in your memory, no longer mysterious, but quietly familiar. You let yourself imagine it again, for the last time tonight. A single tomato sitting on a windowsill. Its skin glows with the soft blush of late afternoon sun. Dust floats lazily through the light. Somewhere outside, a bee hums past a screen door. The world is warm and still, and that round, red fruit, it waits. No longer to be proven innocent, no longer to be defended or doubted, but simply to be appreciated, the way we come to appreciate old stories, even the strange ones, because the tomato has always been more than food. It has been a mirror, a reflection of our fears and our trust, our confusion and our clarity, our need to explain the world, even when we get it wrong. It has endured suspicion, suspicion softened into curiosity, and curiosity eventually ripened into love. It reminds you how long it can take for something or someone to be fully seen, how slow trust can be, how many seasons must pass before we let go of myths and begin again. There's something poetic in that, something worth keeping close. Tonight, as you lie in your own quiet room, tucked under the hush of soft sheets, you can feel the echoes of this journey still circling gently through your thoughts. Not in any rush, not demanding attention, but drifting, like the scent of something familiar cooking in the next room. The tomato story is not unique because it was feared, but because it endured that fear and stayed. Others might have disappeared under such scrutiny. Other fruits and vegetables were lost to superstition, to disuse, to the changing tides of taste and time. But not the tomato. It waited. Even when called a poison apple, even when scientists lined up in powdered wigs to declare it unfit, even when pewter plates seemed to betray it, the tomato held its ground, grew anyway, crept up trellises, spilled into flower beds, and gently reminded us that truth is often quieter than fear. And still, it grows. In city rooftops, in quiet backyards, in pots on apartment balconies, on vines tangled in the wild corners of forgotten gardens. The tomato never demands much, just sunlight, water, and time. Time, that's always been the lesson, hasn't it? That some things, the best things, require time. To be known, to be trusted, to be loved. And the tomato, with its scarlet patience, shows us how. It teaches us that being misunderstood is not the end of the story. That fear, while loud and persuasive, does not last. That even when entire nations once whispered warnings, once passed plates in suspicion, the truth can still quietly win. Not overnight, but eventually. And when it does, it doesn't gloat. It simply becomes part of the meal, part of the story, part of us. You breathe in slowly now. Let the air fill your chest. Hold it gently for a moment, then let it go. Again. But slower this time. Let your breath match the rhythm of the night. Soft, even, calm. Let your thoughts settle into stillness, like seeds beneath soil. Because this journey, while about tomatoes, was always really about something more. It was about change, about patience, about how we learn to see things differently, and how beautiful that can be. So, tonight, as you drift off, perhaps you'll dream of gardens, of summer warmth and open windows, of long tables set for a meal, with tomatoes sliced and salted, waiting patiently to be savored. Or perhaps you'll dream of something stranger, pewter plates and powdered wigs, old courtrooms and cartoon monsters, laughter in the aisles and juice on the chin of a child who doesn't care what you call it. Fruit or vegetable, poison or prize, villain or friend, the tomato has worn many names. But tonight, it is simply home. And home, as you know, is not just a place. It is a feeling, a return, A gentle, silent knowing that you've made peace with something once feared. You pull your blanket a little closer now. Let your body relax. Let your thoughts grow slow, tender, easy, because the story is done. The fears have faded, and the tomato, bright, patient, unbothered, is still there. On your plate, in your garden, in your dreams, a small, soft triumph, a gentle reminder, a fruit once feared, now loved. Sweet dreams.